Hi, my name is Jennifer Fang. I am a historian of Asian America, and I'm here to speak about the Chinese diaspora in Oregon. I think this is a really important topic because Chinese people have played a really important part in the development of this state, and not enough people know about it.
Please welcome Dr. Jennifer Fang.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. All right. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thank you so much, Stephen, for inviting me. Thank you, Waldo, for helping get this set up. And just thank you all for being here. So Stephen had mentioned the winter 2021 special issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly. This is the cover right here. I wanted to use this journal issue as a way to look at the history of this population and the significance of this history of Chinese people in Oregon. So I, along with Chelsea Rose, guest co-edited this special issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly. It's about Oregon's Chinese diaspora. So Chelsea Rose, I was mentioning her earlier. Chelsea Rose is a historical archaeologist based in Southern Oregon University. She is also the lead of the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project. They are doing amazing work across the state with state and federal agencies, like literally unearthing the history of Chinese people in Oregon. And the OCDP just got $500,000 in federal funding to expand this research. So I think that Oregon's going to get to know a lot more about its Chinese history, which is really cool. So in the process of reviewing the submissions for this special issue, I had the opportunity to learn so much about the current field research that is taking place on Chinese people in Oregon. I should kind of state that I'm not really an expert on Chinese American history in Oregon. I am an expert on Chinese American history, like nationally. I can place it in a national context. I can place it within, how it compares to other immigration histories. But as far as like the nitty gritty about Chinese people in Oregon, I'm not the expert. So when I was reviewing the submissions of the work that's being done by people who are the experts on this subject, I learned a tremendous amount. And I think that, it's in the process of doing this work, I'll explain to you some of these like cohesive, or some of the themes that I think came together as I was reviewing these submissions. So in this special issue, there's just like a huge range of articles. There's an article about a Chinese cowboy who lived near John Day. There are articles about merchants living in the Dalles. There are articles about Chinese would-be immigrants flouting immigration restrictions across the state. There's an article about archaeological excavations of railroad tunnels built by Chinese workers in the Malheur National Forest. There's an absolutely wonderful biography of Louis Chung, who's pictured here with his wife, whose life in Oregon would embody many of the historical shifts and trajectories that Chinese people experienced in the late and early 20th centuries. A lot of the scholarship that is featured in this special issue is previously unknown. I thought that as a whole, the articles covered so much ground, not only in geographical scope, but also in subject matter. And when you take it as a whole, I believe that this, the pieces in this special issue really force a rethinking of Oregon's past and offer a new way of thinking about how Oregon was connected not only to the rest of the West, but also to the rest of the United States and to the Pacific worlds. So in the popular imagination, when we think about the American West, there are certain images that come to mind. There's the image of the empty frontier, which, as we all know, is the frontier was not empty. It was actually populated by many different groups of Native Americans. And there's, the imagery of like individualistic, rugged white pioneers settling this vast empty space, which is also like not really the case. These ideas kind of they predominate the ways that the West has been mythologized in the American popular memory. This particular narrative of westward migration not only obscures the indigenous history of the region and indigenous claims to the land, but it also whitewashes the population of people who played a role in this displacement. So the reality of Oregon's first non-indigenous settlers is that they weren't as homogenous as popular memory has made them out to be. There were Black people, there were Asian pioneers settling alongside white pioneers on land stolen from indigenous populations. They came from the East. They also crossed the Pacific Ocean. They came from the South. They also came from the North. The diversity of this population really comes into view as soon as we kind of shift our focus and we center these different histories within this Western history. So going back to this special issue, while I was mulling over the articles in this collection, what becomes apparent to me is that there are a few recurring themes that made it evident to me that these early Chinese diasporic populations were really important players in the early history of Oregon. So I'm going to go over some of the themes, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about just this history in general. So the first recurring theme is that Chinese people were living, working, building communities, creating businesses, and forging social connections throughout the state. They were here as early as 1850, nearly a decade before Oregon even became a state. And they were settling across the state. So here is a map that details where there were Chinese settlements. And by and large, this map and the points on this map mirror the white settlement of this state. So Chinese people built communities of varying sizes in places that have virtually no Chinese residents today, like Jacksonville, Malheur National Forest. They built communities in what would become more urban areas like Salem, the Dalles, Ashland, and Portland. And they built, and there's some places on this map where, there continue to be like sizable Chinese populations. Through census records, which generally undercount non-white immigrant populations, we see that at different times during the first 50 years of this state, Chinese people comprised very significant portions of the population. So in the 1870 census, in Grant County, Chinese people made up 42% of that county. They made up 12% of Jackson County, 19% of Josephine County. In the 1880 census, in Clackamas County and Astoria, it was 30% Chinese. In 1890, in Portland, nearly 10% of the population was Chinese. So before the turn of the 20th century, and for many years after, Oregon's Chinese population was actually the second largest in the United States. I think that these numbers are they're astounding, but then you also have to kind of keep in mind the relativity of it. Like in Grant County, I think the total population was like maybe 900 people. So, it's 42% of 9, it's still 42%, but, overall it's not that many people. So Oregon often gets characterized as this very white state. And yes, it's like, it is. The statistics don't lie. There were all sorts of laws to ensure that this would be the case. But also part of this is, I think, part of the reason why this belief persists is because the dominant histories of this state tend to overlook or ignore the many different groups of people of color who were here not only before white settlers, but whose arrival overlapped with the arrival of European Americans from the eastern parts of this country. So this is about, kind of just like, it's partly about like not an unwillingness, but like it's kind of an unwillingness to acknowledge that like this history does, like, just because Oregon excluded Black people doesn't mean that there were no Black people. There were. Just because there were exclusionary laws against Chinese people doesn't mean that there weren't still people here living and doing things. The second theme is that early Chinese migrants made a living in a number of different ways in Oregon. This fact is worth emphasizing because of the long-held assumptions and stereotypes that early Chinese immigrants were all unskilled workers, or that they worked only on the railroad, or as miners, or in laundries, or in restaurants. The reality of how Chinese people made a living in Oregon is far more complex. So yes, on one hand, you most certainly do have unskilled workers, but you also have highly skilled craftsmen and you have highly skilled cowboys. It also kind of begs the question of like what actually, like no labor is actually unskilled, like all work requires skill. There are also businessmen, there are labor contractors, there were entrepreneurs, there are people who are working within very highly organized transnational business networks and partnerships. Some people amassed significant wealth working as labor contractors, recruiting Chinese laborers to work in white or Chinese-owned industrial and agricultural endeavors. Jin Lin, who's the man pictured here, he is one such example of, a highly successful Chinese businessman. You have also Ying He and Lung An, who are the two men pictured in that group photo. Ying He and Lung An were the owners of Kamwa Chung in John Day, Oregon. Kamwa Chung, for those folks who don't know, was a pharmacy / dry goods store / boarding house / labor contracting place. It was a Chinese-owned business in John Day, Oregon. You can still visit it today. It's very neat. It's part of the Oregon State Park system. But Ying He and Lung An were by all accounts pillars of the John Day community. Lung An was a very successful businessman. He would go on to open the first automobile dealership east of the Cascades, and he was probably the first Chinese American to own a car dealership in the United States. Ying He was a well-respected practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine who treated white Chinese and Chinese patients alike. He treated, a huge proportion of the John Day population. Another famous example is Bing, for whom the Bing cherry is named after. So during the second half of the 19th century, Bing worked as the foreman of Seth Llewellyn's orchard in Milwaukee. He is credited to varying degrees for cultivating the popular Bing cherry. So in rural and in urban places across Oregon, these early Chinese Americans worked in nearly all of Oregon's industries. They ranged from poor laborers to millionaires. Some people like Ying He and Lung An, and even Louis Chung, who is the man pictured on the cover of the Oregon Historical Quarterly, were like model citizens. They were beloved by their community. And by community, I mean, Chinese people and non-Chinese people alike. Other Chinese people were run out of the towns where they lived by angry mobs. This is all to say that there's just a full range of experience here. This wasn't a monolithic community, and it wasn't a monolithic immigrant experience. The third theme is that Chinese people in Oregon lived transnational lives. And this is that part of how Chinese people connected Oregon to other parts of the world, how like they were sort of this link across the Pacific. What I mean by living transnational lives is that Chinese Oregonians maintained deep and sustained connections with China, to their home villages and to their provinces. And these connections were maintained in many different ways. I think there's generally kind of an assumption that immigrants, particularly immigrants, you know, from earlier periods, like when they arrive at a new land, they suddenly lose all connection to the old land, that they never return, that there's like the technology isn't there to like send money or write letters or order, you know, transport supplies to and from, or to travel back home. That just simply wasn't the case. It wasn't the case with Chinese people. It wasn't the case with European immigrants as well, unless, you know, of course, there are some European immigrants who, you know, could not go back, were driven out of their homes. But for many immigrants, there was a constant back and forth between the homeland and the new land. So for early Chinese Oregonians, most of them, regardless of their line of work or their class status, most of them operated within these really complex transnational networks of both business systems and social systems. So these transnational realities offer a line of connection between Oregon and to China and to the Pacific world. It drives home the fact that the development of this state was spurred in part not only by foreign labor, but also by foreign capital and foreign ideas. One of the big reasons why we don't know more about this early population of Chinese Oregonians is that Chinese people in Oregon have been twice erased from the popular memory and from the dominant histories of the state. What I mean by this is that there's kind of two levels of erasure. So the first round of erasure happens through restrictive and discriminatory legislation, which dramatically reduced the amount of Chinese people. It dramatically reduced the population of Chinese people in this state, and it dramatically hindered the ability of Chinese people to immigrate to the United States and to travel between the United States and China. This leads to political, social, and economic marginalization in the places where they lived. The second form of erasure happens through the way knowledge and history is produced and reproduced. So up until only recently, historians of this subject or academics tended to ignore or misinterpret the experiences of Chinese people living in Oregon. There was a tendency in the scholarship to either like diminish the complexities of this population through like an Orientalist or a Eurocentric lens. Here, this is an image of Block 14 at Lone Fir Cemetery, which is in Portland. So Block 14 at Lone Fir was a burial site for over 1,000 Chinese laborers. I share this image in part because I just recently had this conversation with someone who is working on an interpretive project at this site. And she said something to the effect of, the white builders and founders of this city have names and buildings named after them. The Chinese people who literally built this city don't even have gravestones. And so something about Lone Fir, so the Block 14 at Lone Fir, it was a Chinese burial ground. It's a relatively, I mean, it's just a small chunk of Lone Fir. It was a temporary resting place for Chinese people. So the custom among Southern Chinese people who were buried in Lone Fir was that the desire is to have your remains, to have your final resting place be your home village in China, so that your ancestors could care for your grave, because the Chinese practice ancestor worship. This kind of plays into that. So Lone Fir was kind of like a temporary resting place. When Chinese people died and were buried at Lone Fir, they would be interred in Lone Fir for about, I think, a couple of years, and their remains would be later sent back to China. Block 14 over time became like, it was built over. It became this building here, it was like a municipal building. And then the building was demolished. Now it's an empty field. It really doesn't look like much, but there's a desire to kind of reinterpret this space. And the history of Block 14 is, it's really boring. It's just this boring bureaucratic, and then they decided to build this building because they needed a building. They didn't care that Chinese people were buried here. And then the building got torn down and then this and this. But that's kind of how, it was just like a series of mundane decisions that are kind of rooted in some degree of racism that led to this type of erasure. So this is, just one example of how this erasure happens. And I think it's these efforts to reinterpret Lone Fir now, it's such a great example of how people now are trying to reclaim that history and trying to shed light on this history and, explain why it's important that we know about what was here at this site. So this is an image of Portland's First Street, circa 1857. To my knowledge, this is one of the oldest images of Portland that we have, that is known to us. I think this picture offers such a great illustration about this point of erasure and centering Chinese, rethinking Chinese American history, rethinking Western history that I'm trying to make. So pictured here is Portland, 2 years before Oregon became a state. This is First Avenue, which would have been considered a central part of Portland. To me, and perhaps to you too, this scene looks like a stereotypical frontier town. It just looks like the West. You have these wooden buildings, you have these wooden sidewalks, muddy streets, surly looking men outside of these buildings, these horse-drawn carts. And yet, front and center, the only business sign that we can see is the Hopwo Washing and Laundry. This was a Chinese-owned laundry. When you look at this picture at first, you don't totally notice the Hopwo. It's just it's a sign, But once you notice that that's there, how does the Hopwo Laundry here in this landscape, combined with the census data that we know, combined with the sheer diversity of immigrant experiences among these early Chinese migrants, how does this challenge our assumptions of what early Oregon looked like? How does this change our assumptions of who we think, what color the skin is of the people who are standing there on the street? Who those people walking down the street might have looked like. How does that change how we think of that? To me, this picture begs the question of why aren't Chinese people more integrated into our understanding of Oregon's past? And when we do work these early settlers into the dominant historical narrative, how might that change our understanding of place? How might that change our understanding of this country? And how might that change our understanding of this country in relation to the rest of the world? So I'm going to talk a little bit about just kind of this historical trajectory now of Chinese people in Oregon. So from the mid-1800s to 1943, the overwhelming majority of Chinese people who came to the United States, including Oregon, were Cantonese Chinese. Most of these individuals came from like a very specific part of China. They came from rural villages in the Pearl River Delta region of Guangdong province in southern China. During the second half of the 19th century, there was political and social unrest there. There was unsustainable population density, and there was economic uncertainty in this part of China that propelled this migration. This was much more pronounced in this region than it was in other parts of China. One of the largest sending districts was a district known as Taishan. So immigrants from Taishan represented well over half of all of Chinese people in the United States until 1940. I bring this up because this is a very specific group of Chinese people. So these generations of Chinese Americans spoke Cantonese or Taishanese as opposed to Mandarin, which since 1911 has been the national language of China. The cultural practices that these individuals brought with them to the United States and then reproduced in the United States were generally Southern Chinese in style. So the architecture styles, the design styles that you see prevalent in Chinatowns, those styles tend to be Southern Chinese. They don't, if you look at like the styles in Northern China, it's going to look a little bit different. This group of Chinese Cantonese people represent one of the largest human diasporas in history. These migrants went all around the world. Oregon was just one place where they happened to land. While Chinese people settled across Oregon, Portland very quickly became a de facto business and community hub for many people. Chinese people settling in Portland constituted a majority ethnic group in the city. They were second only to German arrivals in 1860, 1870, and 1910. White people, and indeed white Americans like all up and down the coast, white Portlanders took issue with the presence of Chinese people in this city. Though generally speaking, the treatment of Chinese people by Portlanders was relatively mild compared to other parts of the West. So during the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, anti-Chinese sentiments increased and racial violence against Chinese people escalated throughout the West. In Seattle and Tacoma, the Chinese populations there were driven out of those cities. In Los Angeles in 1871, we have the second largest mass lynching in US history, which was a moment in which something like over a dozen Chinese people were lynched by an angry white mob of Angelenos. And here in Oregon City, a mob of men drove about 40 to 50 Chinese mill workers out in 1886. They were forced onto a steamboat that took them up the Willamette to Portland. That same type of violence didn't happen in Portland. It's not to say that there was no racism in Portland, it's just that there wasn't, racial violence in Portland. What happened in Portland was actually that prominent and powerful Portlanders urged calm. They made the case that Chinese people, while they shouldn't be integrated into the mainstreams of society, were nonetheless needed for the development of the city, the state, and the nation. And so they urged Portlanders to remain calm, which generally they did. But as resources and jobs grew scarce, the economy fell into a depression in 1873. During this time, white workers in the West turned against Chinese immigrants, believing that they represented unfair economic competition. The Chinese question went from being a West Coast issue into a national issue, beginning with the 1876 presidential election. During this election, Republicans and Democrats both sought to win Western votes. And so anti-Chinese leaders, which were generally speaking white labor activists, successfully leveraged the power of the regional electorate to demand that lawmakers in DC take action against Chinese immigration. Anti-Chinese advocates sought to restrict Chinese immigration, and they supported the deportation of existing Chinese people in the US. In doing so, they presented a particular image of Chinese men and women as fundamentally and culturally, morally, biologically incompatible with their American counterparts, that they were just like fundamentally un-American. This rhetoric and this, like combined with this violence, would lead to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was the most comprehensive immigration law of its time. It barred the entry of Chinese laborers, while allowing for the entry of some exempt groups of Chinese people. So it allowed for the entry of students, teachers, travelers, merchants, and diplomats. The US wanted to maintain good trade relations with China and good diplomatic relations. And so there were these like exempted groups. This act prohibited all Chinese people also from obtaining naturalized citizenship, which was actually probably the most damaging part of this law. So the population that was already in America could not become US citizens. And if these people decided to return to China, as many Chinese people, they traveled back and forth, they would face trouble re-entering the United States. This law wouldn't be overturned until 1943. It was overturned in 1943 during World War II when China was allied with the United States against Japan. And this repeal was largely a symbolic gesture. Like the United States repealed this law and gave China a quota of like 103 immigrants, which is, just small potatoes. The law would become more thoroughly overturned in 1965 with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which would like overhaul the entire immigration system that the US was working off of. And this law was passed in the midst of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. So it was passed in relationship to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. It's kind of, you can think of it as kind of like a triumvirate. So I bring up the Chinese Exclusion Act and I talk about this so much because it's really important. It's the cornerstone of how Americans come to view all immigration, like not just immigration from China, immigration from anywhere. This was a turning point in the United States, after which point the US increasingly restricted its borders. It legalized xenophobia on an unprecedented scale. It created a category of illegal immigration, and it defined those who fell into this category as criminals, thereby pushing immigrants who entered this country, quote unquote, illegally into the margins of society. Chinese people who were living in the United States after this law was passed were required to carry these certificates of residence, which is actually a precursor to the green card. So the Chinese Exclusion Act essentially creates the apparatus of immigration exclusion. We get the green card from the Chinese Exclusion Act. We get customs and border control from the Exclusion Act. We get, all these other details of how people move to and out, in and out of this country from this law. So this wasn't a law that only affected Chinese people. It would come to influence all subsequent immigration restrictions. This is the moment when the US stops being a nation that welcomed immigrants with an open door and begins to think of immigration as something that needs to be controlled. These are some images of the Angel Island immigration station in the San Francisco Bay Area. Angel Island oftentimes gets compared to Ellis Island in New York. Ellis Island you can largely think of as like a place that welcomed immigrants. Angel Island was largely a detention center. People who came through Angel Island, if they were scrutinized. They were very intensely scrutinized. Many people were detained there for years at a time. Many people were sent back from Angel Island, so it's just it's very different from Ellis Island. The Chinese Exclusion Act, it's this turning point. The U.S. starts thinking about immigration as something that needs to be controlled, and it thinks about this control in a very particular way. So, immigration needs to be controlled. Okay, you can think of there are many different ways in which you can control this immigration, right? You could impose a numerical quota. You could say the U.S. will accept 1 million immigrants a year, first come, first serve. That's an idea. There are many different ways that you can do it. But what ends up happening is that the U.S. decides to control immigration by thinking about which groups of people, quote unquote, deserved to be in the United States and who didn't deserve to be in the United States, who was fit to be an American and who wasn't fit to be an American. So the Chinese people in the United States and in China recognize the racism behind the Exclusion Act. They viewed this law as unjust, as morally and socially illegitimate, and thus unworthy of compliance. We know this in part because Chinese people on both sides of the Pacific engaged in very elaborate processes to circumvent these restrictions. They also used litigation to challenge the legalities of exclusion. They also just straight up disobeyed and defied these laws. One way they did this was through the paper sons system. So Chinese immigration, the Exclusion Act specifically banned Chinese laborers, right? But it allowed for the entry of merchants, diplomats, students, tourists, returning laborers. And so would-be migrants very quickly learned that in order to get into the United States, they had to present themselves to immigration authorities as anything but a Chinese laborer. Typically, what would happen is they would pose as a member of the exempted elite. They would pose as a merchant or as a relative of a merchant who is already in the United States. They would use falsified papers, and they would memorize very elaborate and nitty-gritty details of family histories to be able to fool and to pass these screening examinations that immigration officials would put these would-be immigrants through. Soon, an entire multinational business arose around circumventing these exclusionary laws and selling these falsified papers, selling, the personas of people whose identities could be falsified. So this strategy of getting into the United States was known as the paper sons system. And this strategy was so prevalent during the exclusion era that many present-day Chinese Americans who can trace their family roots back to the exclusion era can find paper sons and daughters in their family history. So Portland has two historic Chinatowns. One is in the southwestern part of downtown Portland. The other is in the northwestern part of downtown Portland. And in looking at these two neighborhoods, we can see how the Chinese Exclusion Act impacted the city's population. So the first Chinatown was in southwest Portland. It stretched, for those of you who are familiar with the layout of downtown Portland, it stretched from approximately Burnside to Montgomery Street. So that's south of the Hawthorne Bridge. It stretched from Front all the way up to 6th. The boundaries it was large. The boundaries were nebulous. And there was a lot of different groups of people living in this area. It was almost not even really a Chinatown. It was just a neighborhood where lots of Chinese people happened to live. Its existence was from roughly the 1860s to the 1910s. Virtually nothing is left of the Chinese part of downtown Portland here. At its peak between 1900 and 1910, this was the second largest Chinatown in the United States after San Francisco. Because this neighborhood took shape after or before exclusionary immigration laws were enacted, it possessed relative economic and generational diversity. There were men, women, children, there were families, there were people operating all sorts of different businesses. There were rich people, poor people. It was just, it was a very diverse neighborhood. Immigrants belonging to the merchant class oftentimes brought wives and children with them, which really complicates the stereotype of Chinatowns being bachelor societies. This is a portrait of the Loon Chin family in Portland circa 1900. One of the daughters so the oldest daughter in this picture, I'm not sure which one she is, but her name was Moy Young. She was believed to be the first Chinese child born in Oregon. She was born in 1866. It's like 1 year after the Civil War ended, or like 2 years after the Civil War ended. So these people, and also I should say, so descendants of this family still live in Portland. They're like fourth or fifth, maybe sixth generation Chinese Portlanders, not just like Chinese Oregonians, like Chinese Portlanders. It's really quite amazing. So between 1900 and 1915, this shift from old Chinatown to new Chinatown happened. At the same time, Portland experienced a population and building boom that would really have a detrimental effect on old Chinatown. So in the eyes of city leaders, the land south of Burnside was becoming far too valuable to be a Chinatown. This population boom in Portland also coincided with the repeated renewals and increased restrictions of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So for Chinese people in Portland, they were facing two formidable challenges. Not only did they have to navigate increasing restrictions and discrimination, but they were also being priced and pushed out of their places of residence and business. Between 1900 and 1930, Portland's general population grew from 90,000 people to 300,000 people. At the same time, the Chinese population dropped from 8,000 people to 1,500 people. So it's this inverse relationship. During this time, many old Chinatown business owners sold their operations or their buildings and they moved away. Some people left Portland altogether. Some people left the United States altogether. We can't quite say where they went. But many people also just moved across Burnside and settled in a multi-ethnic neighborhood that was already home to Japanese immigrants, Scandinavians, Greek, Romani, and Blacks. This neighborhood would come to be known as New Chinatown. So many people know of New Chinatown now as the place where the Chinatown Gate, like that marks New Chinatown. That gate was installed in 1986. So in some ways, New Chinatown was much more of like an ethnic enclave than Old Chinatown was. New Chinatown would eventually develop many characteristics of a ghetto. It would have much firmer and much more fixed borders. The population in this neighborhood would be relatively marginalized from the rest of society. There are very few opportunities outside of Chinatown for Chinese Americans at this time. But nonetheless, life continued. People eked out a living. They built a community. They found joy. They made a life for themselves and their kin in Portland and across the state. They became Americans, at least culturally speaking, during the exclusion years. And they became Americans in part because they adopted some American customs, but also because their long-term presence in the United States broadened and changed, however unconsciously, the very definitions and ideas of what it meant to be an American. So I want to conclude with just a few more ideas. So I want to go back to this point I made about how the first non-native settlers of this region were not just white people. What I've tried to present here is like a brief history of this early Chinese population and make this argument that when we learn about their history, it forces a rethinking of how we think about who built this state and Portland and this region. A lot of work has been done about how Chinese Oregonians have interacted with white Oregonians, like how they've interacted with the mainstreams of society. But, you know, much less work has been done about the ways in which Chinese Oregonians interacted with the many other groups of people living in Oregon. Like every time I give a presentation about this, people ask about, you know, what was the relationship between Chinese and indigenous populations? Like, especially here, I feel like there has to have been something going on, but we just don't, like, not enough work has been done about that to like really have, you know, some facts. Or what was the interaction between, you know, Chinese Oregonians and Black Oregonians? What's going on there? How do these different groups of people like navigate this changing landscape? And so, you know, my hope is that as this research grows, we can unearth more information about these elements of this history. That's it. Thank you very much. Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.